A little history lesson today. I think one of the things that I think history in general is underappreciated. I think we have, going to school, you always, I hate history. It's just a bunch of dates and so on and so forth. I think we have the wrong perspective on history many times. And I think there's no different when it comes to the history of strength conditioning, and more specifically here, strength training. When you look at the history of strength training, it's not that old, depending on if you follow the old Milo story or have you. But there's a study recently published in the Journal of Strength Conditioning Research. And I like physical culture. I try to read physical culture books, and that's what this book review is about. But this is where it got me thinking about it again. And I hadn't read this book that I'm going to talk about in just a second. But it was by Nuzzo. This is the name of the article: History of Strength Conditioning Research in Man and Inventory and Quantitative Overview of Studies Published in English, between 1894 and 1979. So kind of the pre-NSCA birth of strength conditioning that happened post 1979. Just hashing out, some of the first studies in 1894, and then really what kicked off a lot of resistance training, which is DeLorme and Watkins, Dr. DeLorme in particular, post-World War II, and rehabilitating World War II veterans, soldiers coming back and using resistance training. And I'll probably do a review on his book, Progressive Resistance Exercise, PRE. I have it on my shelf there. It's a great book it's the birth of 3 sets of 10, like if you ever want to know where that came from. And so that's part of this, though, is where do we get our information from? What's the history of this? And so if you don't find physical culture particularly appealing, then you may not, on the surface, enjoy it. But I would encourage you to, the book I'm going to review here, MuscleTown, USA, by Fair, I would highly recommend you take a look at it. I think you'll find it intriguing that really is nothing new under the sun. And a lot of these particular training methods, many of them just get recycled. But it's also interesting to look at why we're here today, right? That's what history does, is help. Why are we here today? What have we learned so far? And maybe we've already learned some of these things. So I'll give you an example, post-activation potentiation or post-activation performance enhancement, whatever you want to call it. The research literature has really exploded in the last decade, but it's really comes out of the initial ideas of Yuri Verkhoshansky in the 1960s. So, plyometric training, Yuri Verkhoshansky. Okay, and so these are these are ideas that are very old, if you will, and think of it, and really in the time course of history, they're not old at all. But in terms of our field, if we kept it relative to its existence since the mid 1940s, these are older ideas. So in general, our field, strength field, is very young. And this is why MuscleTown USA, I think, is a great book. To kind of pull in some of the explosion of bodybuilding and weightlifting and how these two sports interact with one another. So I could go in a lot of different directions here. I'll try to stick to the book review here, but I want to give you a little I just wanted to give you a little backstory of why you should care about this. This doesn't seem like a training book or a physiology book, but I find it extremely valuable. By the way, if you ever have a chance to visit the Stark Center, I believe it's called. I've been there. It's the Stark Center. Let's see, there's the Museum of Physical Culture. It's in the one of the end zones at UT Austin. I got a chance to go there when I was coaching at a youth nationals years ago. I was joking, when you're dork about weight training, when you go into, a museum has dumbbells and barbells and you're just totally fascinated by everything, right? Most people would walk in there like, this looks like old gym equipment. What's the big deal? But I would, if you're interested in physical culture, certainly check that out. And Rogue has some pretty interesting videos too about some of the big names in physical culture, or in the history of strength sport and strongman and so forth. Anyway, okay, so I want to talk about MuscleTown USA, just a quick review. So this, in that same vein, in one of the books, like if you're going to start to read a book on physical culture, the history of resistance training, especially in the United States, and how it relates to kind of how it related internationally in weightlifting, I would encourage this book. And so I encourage you to read this book. Just a general synopsis without ruining the story. It's a historical book. It's on Joe Weider, the two main characters, Joe Weider and Bob Hoffman. Bob Hoffman can be regarded as the father of weightlifting, especially in the United States. Certainly the founder of York Barbell, without question. It's his business. Using York Barbell as a place to hire what was some of the great weightlifters of the time. And then how Hoffman and Weider, the rivalry between the two, the birth of bodybuilding, and how why bodybuilding took off and weightlifting really didn't. And Weider's keen sense of business and showmanship, and how that translated into an explosion of bodybuilding. The introduction of protein and the introduction, what I found extraordinarily interesting, introduction of anabolic steroid use, especially in weightlifting, and how the Russians and the United States viewed it, and some research that was done that showed that or supported this idea. There's a doctor, I want to say Dr. Ziegler. It's been a while since I read the book, but that really anabolic steroid use was not very effective, or not effective. And the Russians are like, okay, well, you can think what you want because we're going to start doing it. And so the dominance of American weightlifting started to decrease. Now we could argue there's other reasons. Other sports were pulling away from the talent pool and things like that. But the dominance of weightlifting in the 1960s, 50s, 60s certainly declined precipitously in the 70s as anabolic steroid use really took off. Literally in 1970 was seen to be this turning point. Where people started, athletes and bodybuilders too started using it. And if you look at an old picture of 1965, Dave Draper, winning Mr. America, and he was considered too big back then, and the physique he had, you can type that into Google and look it up, as compared to, what a super heavyweight might look like now. I think you'll see a pretty big disparity between the two physiques. Even the picture, if you look at the picture of Dave Draper, the athletes or the participants, athletes around him, and the physiques that they have, we would regard them as just fairly fit individuals at the gym now. Nothing remarkable. Even Dave Draper, he'd say, "Oh, this dude's built, but he's not really like super jacked or anything." So an interesting history though of how we got to where we're at. There's a lot of rabbit trails. Again, you could look at all these, so many characters in the history of resistance training. But I think this book, MuscleTown USA, if you're interested in this, it's an easy read, in my opinion. It's well organized. It takes you through the history of both sports, kind of how they interacted and fed off of one another, and how they competed against one another. It doesn't. It talks pretty honestly about Bob Hoffman and his personality and the many abrasiveness that he brought to the table in many cases. One of the parts, and I'll leave it here. Some of the research that's been around in the last decade, I've seen it kind of floating around, and it's interesting, is the isometric pulls. So for weightlifting, there was a time there that this came from Hoffman, that isometric training was thought to be the key to success in weightlifting. So if you could just improve your mid-thigh pull rate of force development, now they don't use those terms necessarily, but you can use improve the amount of isometric force at a mid-thigh pull, for example. That was the key to weightlifting success. And then it turns out that it wasn't, especially when anabolic steroid use really took off. But it brings in the recognition of the importance of isometric training and rate of force development at these different joint angles. So we didn't have the research yet to understand specificity of movement, perhaps, but in the rate of force development as a variable, perhaps, because we couldn't, force plates weren't not quite being used yet. And so, again, it's interesting to see where a lot of this information came from. So again, it's like the old 3 sets of 10 thing. Where did that come from? Why did we start with that? Well, they actually started with 10 sets of 10 and then whittled it down to 3 sets of 10 because of the effect. Why not do just like we do today? Why do more when you don't have to? Junk volume, right? And so again, this is where I think the value of books like MuscleTown USA, for those of you who are involved in the field, it will give you some perspective. And while it may not change your training habits or how you train people, you have a better appreciation for where we come from. And then when you see ideas recirculated, and like, oh, this is a new idea, and you say, well, not really. It's just being repackaged, right? Or we're discovering more about that idea than we did before. We've opened up the black box and seen what's inside the black box. Now we understand it because we have better technology and better laboratory equipment to be able to look and see what's going on. But these ideas have been around a long time. If anything, you'll enjoy the personalities that this book brought out between Weider and Hoffman. It's a very interesting story and how they diverged from one another, these two different areas of bodybuilding and weightlifting, how they diverged from one another because of the two visions of these two men. So anyway, that's it. Again, kind of an oddball book, more historical, definitely a historical book, but I think one you'd enjoy. And there's a lot of, I don't say a lot, there's a fair amount of other physical culture books that would be worth reading. If this is of interest, I'll leave a comment and I'll review some of those books I've read as well. A lot of them in bodybuilding, but there are a few others as well. So it's an area I've read in a little bit, and I enjoy it. And so, I'd happy to share with you other books recommendations, perhaps. Okay, if you haven't already, subscribed to my channel. Like this video if you liked it. If you didn't like it, I guess just maybe ignore it. And check out my playlists of all kinds of things, strength conditioning, fitness, nutrition related, book reviews, journal reviews, rants, general topics, physiological concepts, you name it. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.